So, our friend Pope Boniface VIII, elected in the very, very late 13th century. I don't have the readings, the notes in front of me. I think 1298, roughly. In any event, the important date for us here with Pope Boniface VIII is the year 1300. So the first thing that he does, as I just mentioned, is that he ramps up the idea of the weight, the superiority of de jure pontificio over de jure divino to an unprecedented height. And he does this through an edict, a papal bull called Unam Sanctam, one holy thing only. And elements of this were already in the Dictatus Papae of Pope Gregory VII back in 1075, we already discussed. But this formalizes it, namely that Unam Sanctam under Pope Boniface VIII says that all living popes, by virtue of the fact that they are the successors of Simon Peter, Simon the Rock, consequently the vicar of Christ on earth, and the Pontifex Maximus, that all living popes are living saints. You cannot get any more God on earth than that. Not even Jesus Christ managed to pull that one off. In fact, well, we know that story. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that Pope Boniface VIII said, we're missing out on something here regarding the buying and selling of indulgences. We started out with Seamus, you'll recall, back in the 6th century, whittling figurines out of wood of Mary and the saints to sell. That wound up becoming nobles paying to build chapels, then churches, then crusades. Boniface VIII, Pope Boniface VIII, 1300, comes up with a brilliant idea. In fact, he must have been saying, I can't believe somebody didn't give me a PhD for this idea. Of course, I am Pope. Boniface says, why don't, for an entire year, transform the entire city of Rome into one big plenary indulgence? Brilliant. You come to Rome, you jump through certain religious, spiritual, theological hoops, visit certain designated sanctuaries, shrines, burial places of the early Christian martyrs, etc. You go through a certain number of religious rituals, the sacrament of confession, penance, reconciliation, celebrate the liturgy, celebrate a number of other rites, prayers. And for doing so, you get a plenary indulgence. Brilliant. And for the first time ever in the history of the church, in the year 1300, Pope Boniface VIII will inaugurate the first ever Jubilee year, or Holy Year. Now he's able to justify this, if you will, theologically, in terms of Christian theology, or for that matter, Hebraic, Jewish theology based on a practice among the ancient Israelites before the times of King Saul, King David, King Solomon, when the Israelites were still functioning under Mosaic law, but in the tribal system, that is the 12 tribes of Israel. And you can find this on your own as you peruse the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian Old Testament. Every roughly 60 years, within every tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel, every village, community, town therein, the community would get together, obviously under the direction, administration, presiding of their judge. That is the time of the judges in Israel of Mosaic law. Every 6 years they'd get together and they would they'd grab a goat, stick it in the middle of the town. Everybody'd stand around in a circle and they'd spit on it, they'd yell at it, they'd throw rocks at it, they'd curse at it. And then the judge, presumably, or who for him, would smack the goat in the ass, and it would go running out of the village to eventually die somewhere along the landscape. Consequently, the term scapegoat. That is, symbolically, this goat, don't ask me how, but this is the idea. The goat was carrying out of the community, ex communio, all of the sins of every member of that community. And in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, this was called the Jubilee, which transliterated into Latin is jubileum, or in English, Jubilee. So a Jubilee. And the first ever Jubilee for a whole year, hence Jubilee year, or Holy Year, is convoked under Pope Boniface VIII in the year 1300. You come to Rome, you do all these things, and you receive a plenary indulgence. Again, don't think idealistically. Okay, you don't care about religion. You're not a practitioner. You're not a believer. Doesn't matter. Think cynically, practically, pragmatically. This is a huge, immediate, local economic injection into Rome. Think, if you're coming from Bath, England, you're going to make a pilgrimage to Rome. Again, this is before EasyJet, Virgin Atlantic. There's no cheap flights. It takes days and days if you're traveling from that long distance to get to Rome. In other words, you're not just coming for the weekend on a 30-euro ticket. You're going to stay several days, maybe a week. Where are you going to stay? You're going to stay in a hospital or a hostel. It's not for free. You're going to have to eat. And before you leave, you'll probably wind up to you'll probably want to pick up at least a couple of Popeners or other souvenirs before you leave. I hope you were able to get your Popeners before. Those of you who left Rome. The Popeners, the bottle openers. They sell around the Vatican with the Pope's face on it. Anyway. People are going to be spending money. This works brilliantly. So much so that, famously, the so-called father of Italian literature, Dante Alighieri, comes from Florence for the Jubilee here in Rome in the year 1300. And in fact, he puts Pope Boniface VIII in, I don't know, I always forget, the fourth or sixth circle of hell in the third part of his trilogy, Inferno. So the Divine Comedy, Paradiso, Purgatorio, Inferno. So he puts Boniface in one of the rings of hell. More importantly, in his notes, because he kept like a diary, so it's not in the Divine Comedy, but in his other writings, he reflects on his experience of participating in the Jubilee of 1300 here in Rome. And he remarks while he's walking from Castel Sant'Angelo, I hope you all remember that, up to St. Peter's Basilica, meandering through at the time were a lot of different meandering medieval streets. He just remarks that he was shocked at the number of sacristans, custodians, that were literally raking in the monetary offerings dropped by these pilgrims as they're making their way to visit and pray at the tomb of St. Peter inside of St. Peter's Basilica. And this, the Jubilee of 1300, unbeknownst even to apparently a lot of Italian literature experts, this was the singular impetus and inspiration for him, for Dante, to compose his Divine Comedy. The Jubilee of the year 1300 under Pope Boniface VIII. Okay. Pope Boniface VIII dies then in the year 1305, and a French cardinal is elected pope. And after only a couple of years, by 1307, conveniently, French cardinal, elected pope, conveniently allows himself to be kidnapped and taken to the south of France, to a town called Avignon. Avignon. Again, it sounds better in French. Avignon. Maybe not how I say it, but you get the idea. Avignon. And for the next 70 or so years, the next 7 popes, they will not only all be French, they'll never leave Avignon, much less come back to the Italian peninsula, and for that matter, the Papal States and Rome. Now, did they have a justification for this? Sure. Convenient. Picking up what I mentioned previously, a little something called the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which was introduced in the late 13th century, so just a couple of decades earlier, not just by the Mongolian horde that got baptized at the Second Council of Lyons in 1274, but also all of the incoming traffic from the east, the Silk Roads, the Spice Roads, bringing goods, imports into the European continent. We don't know exactly how many people in the European continent died in the 14th and early 15th centuries, so the 1300s into the early 1400s, from the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Historians like to guesstimate somewhere between 20 to 60 million. We'll take the conservative guesstimate, once again, 20 million. 20 million people dead. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of the population of the European continent wiped out. So the popes had a good reason, perhaps, to stay in that little enclave in Avignon and not come back to Rome, the heart of the Italian peninsula, because especially the Italian peninsula was the hardest hit area of anywhere else in the European continent from the bubonic plague, from the Black Death. Does that make us think of something going on right now? Anyway, I digress. Between the years then 1375 and 1415, we have something that occurs referred to by historians as the Western Schism. Not the Great Schism from 1054, but the Western Schism. That is, following this episode of the Pope's abandoning Rome for 70 or so years, nancing around in the south of France, between 1375 and 1415, 1417, there are as many as 3 to 5 different guys claiming to be or being claimed to be Pope at any given moment. This is referred to as the Western Schism, and we must say that as just a point of accuracy, precision, there is argument to be made, and many historians have done that over the past few centuries, that at this point, the line of Roman succession, that is the Pope today actually really linked all the way back to Simon Peter, or did this moment, the Western rupture, the Western Schism, kind of screw all that up? That remains open to debate, argument. For our purposes in this course, we take the approach that the line was not broken, the line of succession was not broken. In any event, at the very best, no one can deny that there effectively was no Pope for this other period, 1375 to 1415, 1417. That leads us to point 2.B on your worksheets, the notes, the Council of Basel, Ferrara, and Florence, which you'll notice, strange dates here. There's kind of a wide gap. It says that it lasts from 1417 until 1439. Why? Hence the name Council of Basel, Constance, Ferrara, Florence. They had to keep moving it. Take a wild guess why? Because of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. The importance of this this ecumenical council, formal, once again, umpteenth time, formal reunification between Constantinople and Rome, the East and the West, in terms of Christianity. It's considered to end when all of these would-be pretenders and contenders to the cathedra, Petri, the chair of Peter, the Pope, everybody gives up, and the council decides to elect an Italian cardinal, last name Colonna, who takes the name of Martin. He'll be the 5th Pope Martin, Pope Martin V. And going back to when we began the discussion of the medieval period, this is the moment when we decide, when we say that the medieval period formally ends, at least in terms of Rome and Italy, and the Rinascimento, the Renaissance, begins. We also like to refer to this period, that is from the time that the popes start living in Avignon, so from 1305 until this moment, 1415, instead of calling it the medieval period or the late medieval period, because historians like to argue about that, we, and by we I mean me, have coined a new term. The Proto-Rinascimento, the Proto-Renaissance. That is this gray, weird period between when does the medieval period really end and the Renaissance begin. Doesn't happen overnight. It's a gray period. The Proto-Renaissance. So 1305 to really 1431, which is when Pope Martin V dies here in Rome. He's the first pope to, after this almost 120-year absence, he's the first pope to actually come back to Rome. Okay. While the Pope's away, the rats will play. And no, I'm not just talking about those rats carrying the infected fleas of, or with the bubonic plague, running amok in the Italian peninsula and elsewhere in the European continent. Rather, I'm referring to the ongoing systemic corruption, not just in the papacy or the Catholic Church, but in society at large. And so it's no mistake that, notwithstanding the efforts of those two sincere mendicants, Dominic and Francis, that apparently their efforts were not enough. So much so that the Proto-Reformation begins to emerge at this same time, inaugurated famously, or at least historically, we look back and say these are the guys that really kind of brought it on. What would become the Protestant Reformation, not yet for still at least 150, 200 years. Two guys. The second guy first. The second guy was a Bohemian. By that I don't mean some, what do they call it, a buckster or a, well, whatever, people living on street corners in Seattle and Portland. Anyway, a Bohemian, that is someone from what is today the Czech Republic. He was a Catholic priest and wound up becoming the rector, you would say president, of one of those universities, the University of Prague, in the late 1300s. And that this council, Basel, Constance, Ferrara, Florence, in 1415, has Jan Hus, his name is Janhus, Jan Hus. They have him brought to the council in Constance. He's put on trial for heresy, found guilty, and is sentenced to death by being burned at the stake. What was so dangerous about Father Jan Hus, the second guy I mentioned, the second proto-reformer? Well, to understand what was so dangerous about him, we need to go to his predecessor, the first guy, the Englishman, also a priest, and in due time the rector of Oxford University in England, a guy named John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe, he died already in 1384, but in 1428, the Pope here in Rome, Pope Martin V, the first Pope to come back to Rome, because his ideas were so dangerous, the Pope sends word to the King of England to have John Wycliffe's decomposing body dug up, exhumed, and promptly publicly burned at the stake. What was so dangerous about these two guys? They're Catholic priests, after all. Well, it was because they had a couple of ideas that were actually not too far removed from at least the ideas of Francis, maybe not so much Dominic, but certainly Francis, regarding reform of the Roman Catholic Church, corruption. What are we doing? The first thing is that Wycliffe says, to figure out what would Jesus do, why shouldn't we allow people to be able to figure that out for themselves? Now, admittedly, at this time, the vast majority of the population remains illiterate. But John Wycliffe says, why don't we, at least for those few who can speak, maybe not ancient Hebrew, Latin, Greek, maybe we could translate it into their own modern language at least, and who knows what'll happen. And so this guy, John Wycliffe, will make the first ever translation of the Christian Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, into a modern language, happens to be English. And his translation of the Bible is forever after known as Wycliffe's Bible. The real reason is Wycliffe said, if we want to really figure out what would Jesus do, why don't we let people read that for themselves and come to some conclusion on their own? It may be inaccurate, it may be accurate, right or wrong, but at least give them the chance. Okay. In Wycliffe's own process of doing this, Wycliffe says, I don't see any scriptural references to de jure pontificio anywhere in the New Testament. Jesus certainly never talks about it. And for that matter, none of the other authors of other books of the New Testament mention it. So I don't see any scriptural basis for that idea, de jure pontificio. Moreover, this buying and selling of indulgences, that's nowhere to be found. And the practice seems inherently corrupt, at least because the only ones making money don't really seem to be too interested in what would Jesus do, much less actually helping people to receive divine grace, mercy, favor. Which leads him to his final point, the idea that, with all that said, if you read the Gospels, the ipsissima verba, the words themselves of Jesus Christ, he seems to be much more in favor of a church of the poor than a church of the rich. Well, as you can imagine, more than a few monarchs, popes, members of the political establishment, etc., throughout Europe find this to be problematic as well. Consequently, very dangerous. What's the importance of Jan Hus? Because John Wycliffe's in England, which, remember, it's basically a big island, not the continent of Europe. Again, don't think of today, EasyJet, whatever, even ferries. It's Jan Hus that takes John Wycliffe's ideas and introduces them, spreads them, promulgates them throughout the European continent. Consequently, that's why he is deemed dangerous, guilty of heresy, and winds up getting burned at the stake in 1415. Okay. That leaves us with just a couple of more things briefly here. Following Pope Martin V dies in 1431 here in Rome. Shortly after him, Pope Eugene IV, just as far as the notes quickly, church-sanctioned slavery, allowing these nation states in Europe, Spain and Portugal, to traffic in slavery, not based on race, mind you, but based on the fact that they're not Christian. So if they're pagan out of sub-Saharan Africa or Muslim, you can engage in enslaving them. The edict, the papal bull, is Creator Omnium, creator of all things, rather ironically named. Pope Eugene IV is also the first guy who will introduce in Rome, properly speaking, the first Renaissance, Italian Renaissance artist, Beato Angelico, Fra Angelico. So if you thought it was just a liqueur, it's not. It's the name of the guy from Florence, Dominican priest who comes to Rome. He's the first properly Italian Renaissance artist who will work in Rome. And finally, Pope Nicholas V, a very forgotten pope, but rather important. He's really the reason why Constantinople fell in 1453. He was so concerned about putting down the pig farmers' rebellion here in Rome, named after the Florentine noble family in Rome, the Porcari family, that tried to overthrow the Pope in 1452. He discovered the rebellion, took time doing that, and consequently did not organize armies to go to Constantinople to protect it from the sack of the Ottoman Turks, and consequently Constantinople fell in 1453. Ironically, the year before, 1452, we have the most famous Italian Renaissance thinker, polyglot, polymath, Renaissance man, a guy named Leonardo da Vinci. And we'll pick it up there next time.